The handshake came at 5 in the morning. Garrett Vance stood on the porch of his farmhouse with the gray light just beginning to soften the eastern ridgeline, and he held out his hand the way a man holds out a receipt. He was a tall man, thin through the shoulders, with the kind of weathered face that had been carved by 46 Kentucky winters and showed every one of them in the creases around his eyes. He had risen before dawn that morning, the same as he had risen before dawn every morning of his adult life. He had put on his work shirt and his work trousers and his work boots, and then he had walked out to the road in front of his house and set down a canvas sack containing one cotton dress, one wool coat, a paring knife, a ball of twine, and $4.30 in mixed coin. He had set it down with the same matter-of-fact precision he used when setting down a sack of feed at the barn. Then he had called for his niece. Hetty Vance was 17 years old that morning. 17 years old that very day, in fact, which was the 6th of April in the year 1893, and which her uncle had not forgotten, because her uncle had been waiting for it for 4 years. He had marked it on the kitchen calendar with a small pencil cross. He had counted down to it the way another man might count down to a wedding or a harvest. He had circled it not out of cruelty but out of arithmetic, because Garrett Vance was a man who believed that every kindness in this world had a beginning and an ending, and that a fair man kept track of both. She came out onto the porch in the dress she had been wearing for 3 years. Her hair was the color of dark wheat, just before harvest, pulled back in a single braid that fell to the middle of her back, and her eyes were the gray-green of river stones under shallow water. She was tall for a girl, with the long arms and squared shoulders of someone who had spent 4 years pulling weeds and hauling water and lifting things heavier than herself. She looked at the sack on the road. Then she looked at her uncle. He held out his hand. "Happy birthday, Hetty," he said. "The arrangement's done." She did not cry. She had thought about this morning for 2 years, ever since she had first understood that the calendar mark in the kitchen was a countdown. And she had decided sometime around her 15th birthday that she would not cry when it came. She wouldn't beg. She would not argue. She would take the hand he offered and shake it once, and then she would walk down the road and not look back. Because looking back was for people who still believed something behind them might change. She took his hand. His palm was dry and rough, and exactly as warm as the hand of a man closing a business deal. He shook her hand twice. He held it for perhaps 2 seconds. Then he let go. "There's biscuits in the sack," he said, "wrapped in the brown cloth. Should hold you to noon." "Thank you," she said. "You're a good worker, Hetty. Always were." "Thank you, Uncle Garrett." He nodded. He waited for her to say something else, perhaps, to ask where she was supposed to go, perhaps to make some final request. He could refuse, but she did not say anything else. She walked down the porch steps and out onto the road and picked up the canvas sack and slung it over her shoulder. And she began to walk south on the Grayson Road in the gray light of an April morning that had not yet committed to being warm. She did not look back. Garrett Vance stood on the porch and watched her until she was a dark figure against the lighter dust of the road, and then he watched her until she was only a dot. And then he watched her until she was gone. Then he went inside and ate his breakfast. The road south wound through hollows that had not yet woken up. Dogwoods stood in white drifts along the creek bottoms, and the air smelled of cold water and the sharp green of new grass, and the bitter undersmell of last year's leaves rotting in the ditches. A few wood smoke columns climbed straight up from chimneys that had just been lit, and from somewhere over the eastern ridge a rooster crowed, and from somewhere else further off another rooster answered him. Hetty walked. She had walked this road many times before. but never as a person who did not know where she was going. She had walked it to the post office and to the dry goods store, and to the spring sociables at Mount Olivet Church. And every time before she had walked it, with the understanding that the road ended somewhere, and that somewhere was a place that belonged to her in some manner, even if only as a niece in a borrowed bedroom. This morning the road did not end anywhere. It only continued. $4.30. She had counted it twice in the kitchen before he came down. 3 silver dollars, 1 tarnished half-dollar, 2 quarters, 3 dimes, 2 nickels. The coins had a weight to them, the weight of everything she owned in the world. She had wrapped them in a strip of linen and tucked them inside the sack against her ribs so they would not jingle when she walked. Her mother had died when she was 13. Charity Vance had been the kind of woman who could read the weather from the shape of a cloud and the temper of a horse from the way it set its ears. And she had been 34 years old when the fever took her in the autumn of 1889. It had taken her in 11 days. She had gone from a woman who hung wash on a Tuesday to a woman who lay still under a quilt on a Saturday, to a woman who was not in the world at all on the following Wednesday. They buried her on the ridge above the family cabin in the small plot where Hetty's grandparents had been laid down in turn, and her father stood at the grave with his hat in his hands and did not say one word. 3 weeks later, her father was also gone. He had not said goodbye. He had taken the mule and the rifle and the small leather pouch in which he kept his money. And he had walked out of the cabin one morning before sunrise, the way a man walks out to check a trap line. And he had not come back. Hetty had waited for him 3 days. On the 4th day, her Uncle Garrett came up the ridge and looked at the empty cabin and looked at the 13-year-old girl sitting on the porch and said only, "Get your things." She had gotten her things. She had lived in Garrett Vance's house for 4 years. She had slept in a small room off the kitchen that had been built originally for a hired man. And she had worked the same as a hired man. And she had eaten at the same table as Garrett's 3 children and his wife Esther, who was kind in the small ways that did not cost her anything and indifferent in all the larger ways that did. Hetty had pulled weeds in the corn rows. She had carried water from the spring. She had milked the cow and churned the butter and gathered the eggs and split the kindling for the morning fire. She had done all of this without complaint because she understood in the way that children of certain kinds of households understand that her place at the table was conditional, and that the condition was her usefulness. The arrangement was done. She walked. The Carter County Land Office sat on the corner of Main Street and Court Street in the town of Grayson, in a narrow brick building with a green-painted door and a small brass plate that read, "Office of the County Clerk Land Records." It was a building Hetty had walked past perhaps 30 times in her life and never once entered. She had not known until that morning that you could enter such a building if you were a 17-year-old girl with $4.30 and no living parents and no fixed address. You could. The clerk was a man named Harlan Brashear. He was 61 years old and had been the clerk of records in Carter County for 29 years. And he had the bearing of a man who had handed papers across a wooden counter for so long that the act had worn a kind of patience into his bones. He looked up when she came through the door. He took in the canvas sack on her shoulder and the dust on her boots and the $4.30 she set on the counter in a neat little stack of coins. And he did not register surprise. He said, "You looking for land, miss?" She said, "I am." "You got somebody with you?" "No, sir." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached under the counter and brought up a large ledger book bound in brown leather and a square map of Carter County that had been pinned at the corners and folded twice and unfolded so many times that the creases had begun to wear through. He laid the map on the counter and turned it so it faced her. "What land you looking for, miss?" She knew the answer to this question because she had been thinking about the answer for 2 years. She had been thinking about it every time she walked past the bald ridge between the Sandy Creek hollows on her way to and from her uncle's fields. She had been thinking about it every time she looked up from her work and saw the empty line of that ridge against the sky. The dead stumps standing in their rows, the grass leaning northeast in the wind like the hair on a dog that had been running. She put her finger on the map. She put it on the line of the ridge between the two hollows, and she said, "This one." Harlan Brashear looked down at where her finger was pointing. Then he looked up at her face. Then he looked back down at the map. He did not say anything for what felt like a long time. He pulled a small pair of wire spectacles out of his vest pocket and set them on his nose and bent over the map and examined the parcel as if he had not seen it before, although he had seen it many times before. He read the small number printed alongside the parcel boundary. He flipped open the brown ledger book and turned through several pages and found the entry for that number and read it carefully. He took off the spectacles. He folded them. He looked at Hetty. He said, "Miss, that is the windy one." She said, "I know. 2 families have filed on that ridge, miss, in the last 20 years. How long did they stay?" He hesitated. He looked down at the ledger again. Then he looked up at her, and she could see something move in his face, something he was deciding whether or not to tell her. And after a moment, he decided to tell her. He said, "The first family, the Coggins, they had a boy and a girl. They built up there in 1878. They lasted 1 winter. The boy took sick in February, the kind of sick that comes from sleeping where the wind never stops. They moved down to the hollow in March and never went back up." She nodded. She waited. He said, "The second family, the Sturts, they came up in the spring of 1886. Husband and wife and a baby that was born up there in June. The baby was healthy when it was born. Strong baby. The wife said so." He paused. He looked down at the ledger. He did not look at Hetty when he said the next part. "The baby died in August," he said. "Hot summer night. They woke up in the morning and the baby was cold. The doctor came up from town. He said the night wind had pulled the warmth out of the child while it slept. He said it shouldn't have happened. Said babies don't usually die from a summer breeze. But that ridge isn't a summer breeze, miss. That ridge is something else." He stopped. He let it sit there between them on the counter. The clock on the wall behind him ticked 12 times and 12 times and 12 times. "The wife," he said finally. "She walked down to town the following week. She did not say a word to anybody. She got on the eastbound train. She never came back. The husband sold the parcel back to the county for what he had paid for it, which was very little, and he went west, and nobody has heard from him since. The Sturts. That was their name. That parcel has been sitting on this map for 7 years, miss. People in this county. They have a name for it now." She waited. He said, "They call it the Cursed Acre." Hetty did not move. She did not look at the map. She did not look at her hands. She looked at Harlan Brashear's face, and she understood that he was not telling her this because he wanted to scare her off. He was telling her this because he was a decent man, and she was 17 years old, and he wanted her to walk back out the door and find somewhere else. She thought about the $4.30 on the counter. She thought about the canvas sack on her shoulder. She thought about the road south of Grayson and where it went and what was at the end of it for a 17-year-old girl with no people and no place. She said, "I'll take it." He looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded once. He took up his pen and dipped it in the inkwell and began to fill out the filing forms in his slow, careful clerk's hand. The filing fee was $3.75, which left her with 55 cents in the world, and she watched him slide the coins across the counter and into a small wooden tray, and she signed her name on the line he pointed to. He stamped the paper. He pushed it across to her. "Quarter section," he said. "Bald Ridge, between the two hollows. 160 acres. Title vests on proof of residence 5 years. Good luck to you, Miss Vance." She folded the paper and put it inside her dress against her heart. She walked out into the noon sun. The Bald Ridge was visible from the edge of Grayson. You could stand on Main Street and look northeast and see it rising above the hollows, the long empty spine of it, the dead stumps catching the light. Hetty stood there in the road for a moment and looked at the thing that now belonged to her. And then she shifted the canvas sack on her shoulder and began to walk. It took her 4 hours to reach the base of the ridge. It took her another 2 hours to climb it. The trail up was not really a trail. It was a place where the grass had been worn down by deer and by the boots of a few curious men who had come up over the years to see what was left of the Coggins cabin, or to look at where the Sturt baby had been born. The slope was steep enough that she had to lean forward into it, and the wind, which had been only a breeze in the hollow, grew stronger. With every 50 feet she climbed until, by the time she stepped over the top of the ridge, it was a constant pressure against the left side of her body, pushing her steadily eastward, like a hand laid against her ribs. She stood on the top of the ridge. The wind was coming out of the northwest at perhaps 18 miles an hour. The grass leaned to the northeast in long combed waves. The dead stumps stood in their rows where the timber company from Ashland had left them. 12 years before, gray and weathered and rotted hollow in the centers and between the stumps, the red clay of the ridgetop showed through the grass in patches the color of dried blood. She turned in a full circle. She could see for 15 miles in every direction. The Sandy Creek Hollow opened to the north dark with hemlock and oak. The Plum Branch Hollow opened to the south paler with poplar and sycamore. To the east, ridge after ridge rolled toward Virginia. To the west, the land descended in long terrace slopes toward the Ohio River Valley 100 miles away. She was the only person in any direction. She set down the canvas sack at the foot of the largest stump. She began to think about how she would survive the night. The temperature dropped after sundown, the way it drops in Kentucky in early April, which is to say it dropped quickly and without sentiment. By the time the last light went out of the western sky, the thermometer in town read 43 degrees, and the thermometer on the ridge, if there had been one, would have read about the same, but the wind made it feel like 25. Hetty did not have a thermometer. She had the wool coat her mother had sewn for her when she was 14, and which had grown too short in the sleeves, and she had the canvas sack with the dress folded inside it, which she used as a pillow, and she had the paring knife and the ball of twine, and the brown cloth with the biscuits that her uncle had wrapped that morning. She ate one biscuit. She wrapped the rest back up. She lay down in the small depression of bare earth behind the largest stump on the lee side, with her back against the wood, and her face turned away from the wind, and she pulled the wool coat over herself and tucked her hands inside her sleeves and pressed her knees to her chest. The wind blew over the top of the stump and around its sides and through the gaps in its rotted heartwood. It found her. It pressed itself into the small space between her coat and her body. It pulled the warmth out of her the way the doctor had said it had pulled the warmth out of the Sturt baby in August of 1886. She lay there in the dark and listened to it howl over the ridge, and she did not sleep and she did not cry, and somewhere around 3 in the morning she began to understand in a way she had not understood before, that the wind was not weather. The wind was the thing. The wind was what she had bought. She slept perhaps 2 hours. She woke when the first gray of the eastern sky began to lift the silhouettes of the dead stumps out of the dark, and she sat up and rubbed her hands together and felt the cold in her bones, the way you feel a bruise on the second day. She ate a second biscuit. She watched the light come. Then she stood up and began to work. She had seen sod houses in the photographs in the parlor of the Grayson schoolhouse, where a traveling teacher had once given a lecture on the settling of the Great Plains. She remembered the pictures. Square brick walls cut from the prairie grass roofs of branch and grass and dirt, men and women and children standing in front of their homes with the unsmiling faces of people who had been told to hold still. The sod house had been the answer for the prairie. The sod house could be the answer for the ridge. She cut sod that morning with the paring knife. She cut it in bricks roughly 12 inches by 18 inches, slicing down through the matted ridge grass and the 4-inch layer of topsoil beneath it, until she hit the red clay, and then she pried each brick up with the blade and stacked them along the lee side of the largest stump. The work was slow. The paring knife had not been made for sod. The blade dulled after the first dozen bricks, and she had to stop and sharpen it on a flat stone she found among the roots, and even sharpened it was a knife meant for paring apples, not for cutting earth. She worked from sunrise to noon. She had 30 bricks. She needed perhaps 300. She ate a third biscuit. She kept working. By the end of the second day, she had 90 bricks, and by the end of the fourth, she had 240. And on the morning of the fifth day, she began to lay the walls. She built them in a U-shape on the lee side of the ridge open to the south, the way she remembered the photographs. She stacked the bricks 3 high and 3 wide and packed loose earth into the gaps. She cut branches from the dead stumps for the roof beams. She bundled grass with the twine and laid it across the branches and weighted it down with smaller stones she carried up from the hollow. She finished the shelter on the afternoon of the 7th day. It held for 11 days. On the 12th morning, the wind came out of the southwest at a speed she would later learn was about 30 miles an hour, and it came from a direction the U-shape had not been built to deflect. And it found the south-facing opening and drove straight into it, and lifted the roof off in one piece, with a sound like a bedsheet being snapped, and deposited the roof 30 feet downslope in the scrub, where it landed upside down and looked like the nest of some very large bird that had been evicted from its tree. The sod walls, without the weight of the roof, sagged. By the next morning, they looked like a row of melting candles. Hetty sat on a stump in the wreckage of her first shelter and ate the last of the biscuits her uncle had wrapped for her 13 days earlier. And she did not cry because crying was not what was needed. And she did not curse because cursing was not what was needed. What was needed was a new shelter. She had cut 300 sod bricks once. She could cut 300 more. She built the second shelter. She oriented the U-shape differently. The closed wall faced the northwest, where the prevailing wind had been when she first arrived, and the open side faced the east, which was the calmest direction in her experience. She made the walls 4 feet high instead of 3. She packed the joints tighter. She used heavier branches for the roof beams. She doubled the twine on the roof bundles. It held for 9 days. On the 10th morning, the wind came out of the east. She had not expected the wind to come out of the east. She had not built the shelter for an eastern wind. She had built it for a northwest wind because the northwest was where the wind had been. Because in her 17 years, she had assumed that wind, like everything else, had a direction it preferred and would mostly stick to. The ridge did not work that way. The ridge was a place where wind could come from any direction at any hour, and the eastern wind on the 10th morning came through the open side of her U-shape at perhaps 25 miles an hour, and knocked the cooking pot off the stone she had been using as a table, and scattered the coals from her fire across the dirt floor, and tore the roof off for the second time. and sent it tumbling down into the same patch of scrub where the first roof had landed. She stood in the wreckage of the second shelter. She looked at the second roof in the scrub. She did not say a word. She built the third shelter. She built it without an opening. She enclosed it completely 4 walls of sod, stacked 4 feet high, with only a small crawl-through on the south side, 2 feet by 2 feet, just large enough for her to slide through on her belly. She cut a flap for the crawl-through out of the lining of her wool coat, because she had no other fabric left, and because at this point she was willing to surrender pieces of her only winter garment in exchange for a shelter that might actually hold. It did not hold. The wind found the crawl-through. It funneled through the small opening at twice the velocity of the open ridge air, because that is what wind does when you give it a narrow passage to travel through. It blew ash from the fire pit into her eyes. It blew dust into her food. It rattled the flap of wool until the wool tore loose from its mooring of twine and flew up into the rafters. She blocked the crawl-through with packed sod. Now she had a sealed box. The moisture from her breath, and from her body and from the damp sod itself, condensed on the inside walls and ran down them in thin rivulets, soaking her blanket and her dress and her wool coat, and turning the dirt floor into a layer of cold red mud that came up through the soles of her boots and crept up the seams of her trousers, and that she could not escape because there was nowhere to go. She lay on the floor of the third shelter in the dark. She listened to the wind howl over the top of the walls. The wind did not want in. The wind had won. The wind was simply passing over her now, the way it had passed over the bald ridge for 12 years, since the timber company had taken the trees, and she lay in the cold mud and understood not with anger and not with self-pity, but with the cold, clean clarity of a person who has failed 3 times at the same problem that she had been trying to do the wrong thing. She had been trying to build a wall. The wind did not care about walls. It was on the second night of the third shelter, lying in the mud with the wool coat soaked through, that she first saw the lamp. She had crawled out of the sealed box to relieve herself, because she could not stand the smell of her own breath in the closed air any longer, and she had stood up on the lee side of the ridge and looked down into the Sandy Creek hollow, and she had seen it. A single yellow point of light. It was perhaps half a mile down the slope in the bottom of the hollow, where the hemlocks grew thick along the creek. It was not moving. It was not flickering. It was the steady amber glow of a kerosene lamp burning in a still place somewhere that the wind did not reach. She watched it for a long time. It did not move. She crawled back into the sealed box. She did not sleep. The lamp was there again the next night, in the same place, at the same hour. She had stepped out of the shelter at perhaps 11 in the evening, and the lamp was burning, and it burned for another hour while she watched it from the lee side of the ridge, and then it went out. The lamp was there on the third night. On the fourth night, she took up the paring knife. She came down the ridge in the dark with the wind at her back and the moon a thin, pale curve over the eastern horizon, and she walked through the hemlocks along the creek, and she found the place where the lamp had been burning, and there was no one there. There was a flat stone the size of a kitchen table. There was the dark circle where a lamp had recently been set down. There were the footprints of a woman pressed deep into the wet earth at the edge of the creek. The prints of a woman who had stood there for a long time, perhaps an hour, perhaps longer. The prints of a woman who was older than Hetty, a woman with the heavy step of someone who had carried a great deal in her life and was still carrying it. The footprints led north along the creek. Hetty did not follow them. She stood on the flat stone in the dark, with the paring knife in her hand. and she understood that someone had been watching her. Someone had been watching her every night from the bottom of the hollow. Someone had been standing in this exact spot for 3 nights in a row, looking up the ridge at the place where Hetty had been failing, and that someone had decided not to come up and not to call out and not to identify herself. Someone had been waiting to see what kind of girl Hetty was. Hetty walked back up the ridge. She crawled into the sealed box. She lay down in the cold mud. She thought about the woman in the hollow. She thought about the lamp burning steady for 3 nights. She thought about a person who could stand for an hour in the cold dark at the edge of a creek to watch a stranger fail at building a house. She thought about all of this for a long time. And then, somewhere in the deep middle of that night, with the wind howling its same indifferent howl over the top of her sod walls, the thing that had been moving in the back of her mind for 13 days finally came forward into the light. She sat up. She sat up in the dark with the wool coat heavy with damp and the mud cold against her knees. And she said the thing aloud, said it to the dark and the wind and the woman in the hollow and her dead mother and her absent father and her uncle who had circled her birthday on a kitchen calendar. Said it to all of them and to none of them. She said, "It's not the house." She said it again. "It's not the house." The wind blew on over the top of the ridge, indifferent. The same wind that had blown for 12 years since the timber company had stripped every oak and hickory and chestnut from the ridge and left only stumps. The same wind that had blown for 1,000 years before the timber company came, except then there had been trees, the great hardwoods of the old Appalachian forest, and the trees had stood against the wind, and the wind had broken on them, and the ridge had been a place where things could live. She thought about the trees. She thought about how long an oak took to grow, 20 years, 40 years, longer than she would be young. She thought about the stumps, the dead, silent witnesses of what had been there before. She thought about the wind, and she understood that no wall she could build would ever stop it. A wall was a single line. The wind came from every direction. The wind found every gap. The wind pressed on every surface until something gave, and something always gave, because a wall was a dead thing and the wind was not. But a tree was not a dead thing. A tree could bend. A tree could move with the wind. A tree could stand against the wind without trying to stop it, by being something the wind could pass through. She did not have 20 years. She did not have an oak. She did not have anything except a paring knife and a ball of twine and a sodden wool coat and 55 cents. And the knowledge that she had been trying to do the wrong thing for 13 days, and that somewhere down in the hollow below her ridge was a woman who had been watching and waiting to see if Hetty was the kind of girl who could understand that. She lay back down in the mud. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep. She waited for the morning. She did not sleep that night, and she did not sleep the next night. And on the morning of the second day after she had crawled down into the hollow and found the footprints by the creek, the woman came up the ridge. It was the 2nd of May, 1893. The sun was perhaps an hour above the eastern horizon. The wind that morning was easy, which on the bald ridge meant about 12 miles an hour. Out of the west, the grass leaning in long combed waves, the way it always leaned. Hetty was sitting on the largest stump with the paring knife across her knees and a piece of stripped bark she had been whittling into. Nothing in particular for the past hour, because her hands had to be doing something, and because she had come to understand in the past 36 hours that waiting was a kind of work that required preparation. She saw the woman coming from a quarter mile down the slope. She was a heavy walker. She had the broad shoulders and broad hips of a woman who had spent her life lifting things, and she came up the trail with a steady, unhurried gait, as if she had walked up this ridge many times before, which Hetty now understood she probably had. She was perhaps 50 years old, perhaps a little older. Her hair was the color of iron filings, and it was pulled back hard against her skull and pinned at the nape of her neck. She wore a long brown skirt and a heavy cotton blouse and a man's wool work jacket that was too big in the shoulders, and she carried in her right hand a short-handled spade with a polished oak handle that had been worn smooth by use, and she carried over her left shoulder a small canvas bag. She stopped at the edge of where the third shelter had been before the wind had taken it apart. She looked at the wreckage. She looked at Hetty on the stump. She did not introduce herself. She did not say good morning. She did not ask Hetty's name, although she clearly already knew it, and she did not offer her own, although she clearly intended to. She stood there in the wind with the spade across her boot tops, and she said one thing. She said, "You cannot build on this ridge." Hetty looked at her. "You can only grow on it." The woman waited. She let the words sit in the wind. She watched Hetty's face the way a person watches a coin to see which way it will fall, and Hetty understood that this was the moment for which the woman had been waiting in the hollow with her kerosene lamp for 3 nights. This was the test. This was what the woman had walked up the ridge to find out. Hetty said, "Grow what?" The woman's mouth moved at the corners. It was not quite a smile. It was the kind of expression a person makes when something they have been hoping for, but not allowing themselves to expect, turns out to be there. "Willow," she said. She set down the spade. She set down the canvas bag. She walked the perimeter of the wreckage of Hetty's third shelter without saying another word, kicking aside the collapsed sod with the toe of her boot, examining the orientation of the failed walls, looking at the patterns of the wear in the ground, where the wind had blown ash and dirt and torn pieces of wool. She walked the full circle, and then she walked it again. And at the end of the second circle, she stopped beside Hetty and looked out across the bare ridgetop and out across the hollows below. She said, "My name is Mabel Doolin. I live in the hollow you can see down to the north. The kerosene lamp belongs to me." "I know," Hetty said. "How long did you know?" 3 nights. Mabel Doolin nodded. She did not look surprised. She looked like a woman who had already decided that Hetty was the kind of person who would have noticed the lamp, and the noticing was part of why she was now standing on this ridge instead of staying down in her hollow. She said, "I had to be sure." Hetty waited. "There have been 2 families on this ridge in my lifetime. I am 51 years old, Miss Vance. I have lived in the hollow below this place since I was 19. I watched the Coggins come up in 78, and I watched them go down in 79. I watched the Sturts come up in 86, and I watched the wife walk past my door in August of that summer, with the baby wrapped in a blanket. And I knew before she said a word what was inside the blanket. I did not go up to either family. I let them try and I let them fail." She paused. "I am not in the habit of climbing this ridge." Hetty looked at her. Mabel Doolin looked back. There was nothing soft in her face. There was no warmth and there was no welcome. There was only the clear, hard appraisal of a woman who had decided after 3 nights of standing in a cold hollow with a kerosene lamp that she was going to make this one and only climb, and who wanted Hetty to understand from the first minute exactly what kind of arrangement was being offered. She said, "I lost a daughter when I was 34. Her name was Lavinia. She was 17 years old. She died in the autumn of 1876 in childbirth on a Tuesday afternoon. And I want you to understand something before we go any further, Miss Vance. Hetty did not move. Mabel Doolin said, I am not looking for a replacement. I did not come up this ridge to find another daughter. Lavinia was Lavinia, and she is gone. And if you think I am here because you happen to be 17 years old, then we are going to have a misunderstanding that will waste both of our time. I am not here to mother you. I am not here to grieve. I am here because this ridge needs someone who is not going to walk back down it. And I have been watching you for 3 weeks. And I think you might be that person. And if I am wrong, you will tell me by quitting, and I will go back to my hollow, and we will never speak of this again. She paused. Are we clear on that? Hetty sat on the stump with the paring knife across her knees and the piece of stripped bark in her hand, and she looked at this iron-haired woman who had walked up a ridge. She did not climb to make an offer. She had not made in 15 years on terms that left no room for sentiment. And Hetty understood in that moment that she was being spoken to as an adult for the first time in her life. She said, We are clear. Mabel Doolin nodded. She picked up her spade. She said, Then let us begin. She began with the contours. She walked Hetty along the northwest face of the ridge, which was the face that took the worst of the winter winds, and she pointed out with the tip of her spade the way the slope fell away, the way the small folds and pockets in the land collected water during the spring rains, and held it for hours before it ran on down to the hollow. She showed Hetty how to read a contour line by eye-sighting along the slope and finding the band where the land neither rose nor fell, but ran sideways across the face of the ridge in a long, shallow shelf. Water moves downhill, she said. Water also rests where it can. If you cut a trench across the face of a slope along a true contour, the water will gather in your trench, and it will not run on past. It will soak. It will soak into the ground on the downhill lip of your trench. It will make the soil there wet enough to keep a willow alive. She paused. A willow stake, Miss Vance. A piece of willow about the thickness of your thumb and the length of your forearm, cut from a living tree with a slant cut at the bottom. Push it into wet ground in the spring. It will root in 9 days. It will leaf in 6 weeks. It will be a tree the height of your shoulder by July, and a tree the height of your head by September. Willow does not wait. Willow does not need anything but water and time, and a willow planted along the downhill lip of a swale gets the water for free. Hetty said. How long is the swale? Mabel Doolin said. Long enough to cross the worst of the wind. She pointed with the spade. She traced a line in the air along the northwest face of the ridge, a long curving line that began at the eastern shoulder of the ridge and ran in a slow crescent across the face and ended at the western shoulder. It was a 1/4 mile long. It was the shape of a thumbnail laid flat against the ridge. 300 feet, Miss Vance. 18 inches deep, 2 feet wide, curving with the contour all the way across. Hetty looked at the line. She said, By hand. Mabel Doolin looked at her. By hand, she said. She handed Hetty the spade. Hetty dug for 2 days. She dug from sunrise to sunset on the 3rd of May, and from sunrise to sunset on the 4th of May, and Mabel Doolin came up the ridge in the morning of the 3rd day with bread and cold pork and a jar of buttermilk, and she sat on a stump and watched Hetty dig, and she did not help. She had brought the food. She had brought the spade. She had explained the work. The work itself was Hetty's. Hetty understood this, and she did not resent it. She had spent 4 years digging in her Uncle Garrett's fields. She knew how to dig. The first 30 feet went easy. The ridge soil at the top was loose and dry, and the spade bit cleanly. And she could throw the dirt downslope to the south, where it would settle into the natural berm along the downhill lip of the trench. After 30 feet, she hit the red clay layer, and the work became harder. The clay was wet enough to be heavy and dry enough to resist the spade, and she had to chop into it with the corner of the blade and lever each chunk up by working the spade like a pry bar. Her hands blistered on the second hour of the second day. They blistered, and then the blisters broke, and then the broken blisters bled into the wood of the spade handle and dried there in dark streaks. She did not stop. She wrapped strips of cloth from the lining of her wool coat around her palms, and she kept digging. By noon of the second day, she had finished 120 feet of trench. By sundown, she had finished 190. She slept beside the trench that night, in the small depression behind the largest stump, and she did not dream. On the morning of the 5th of May, she dug the final 110 feet, and by mid-afternoon, the swale was complete. It was a perfect, curving crescent across the northwest face of the ridge, 300 feet long, 18 inches deep, 2 feet wide. The downhill berm rose in a soft mound, the entire length of the trench made from the soil she had thrown out as she worked. Already after just 2 days, water had begun to gather in the bottom of the swale from a brief rain on the night of the 4th, and the soil along the downhill lip was darker than the surrounding ground. Mabel Doolin came up at sundown. She walked the length of the swale slowly, with her hands clasped behind her back, looking down at the trench, looking down at the wet line of soil along the downhill lip. She walked all 300 feet of it. She walked it back. She stopped at the eastern end, where Hetty was sitting on the ground with her bleeding hands in her lap. She said, "It is true to the contour." Hetty nodded. Mabel Doolin said, "I will bring the stakes tomorrow." She brought 340 willow stakes. She brought them in bundles of 20, tied with strips of inner bark, and she brought them up the ridge in 3 separate trips that took her most of the morning of the 10th of May. The stakes were each the thickness of a thumb and 3 feet long, cut from the willow stand that grew along the creek below her property where her grandmother had planted the original willows 70 years before. Each stake had a slant cut at the bottom, sharp and clean. Each stake had 2 or 3 small buds along its length that had not yet opened. She laid them out in long rows beside the swale. She said, "Now you plant." Hetty planted. She worked along the downhill lip of the trench, pushing each stake 18 inches into the wet soil at 12-inch intervals, tamping the soil down around the base with her boot heel. She did 340 stakes in a single day. She did them in a steady rhythm, the way a person threshes wheat or shucks corn, the rhythm becoming the work, and the work becoming the rhythm. And by the time she planted the last stake at the western end of the crescent, the sun was setting behind the western ridges, and the long shadow of her own body fell across the line of stakes like the shadow of a fence. It looked like a fence of dead sticks from the road below, where 2 farmers on their way home from town stopped to look. It looked exactly like a fence of dead sticks planted in a ditch on a windy ridge by a girl who had clearly lost her mind. One of the farmers laughed. The other shook his head and clucked his tongue. They both rode on. By the next morning, the story was being told at the dry goods store in Grayson. The story of the Vance girl, the orphan that Garrett Vance had thrown out on her birthday, who had taken her $4 and her paring knife up onto the cursed acre and was now planting dead sticks in a ditch because she did not have the sense to lay down and quit. Hetty did not care what they said in Grayson. She walked the line of stakes every morning at dawn. She walked all 300 feet of it, pulling gently on each stake to test for resistance, feeling for the small tug that would mean the wood had decided to live and had pushed roots into the wet soil beneath it. The tug was so faint at first that she could not be sure she was feeling it. By the 5th day, she could feel it on perhaps 50 of the stakes. By the 7th day, she could feel it on perhaps 200. By the 9th day, she could feel it on all but 23. On the 9th day, she sat down at the eastern end of the crescent and put her hands flat on the wet earth. And she did not weep, because weeping was not what was needed. But she sat for a long time, with her hands pressed against the cold ground, and she felt the place where the willows had decided to take root. And she felt the slow first stirring of a thing she had not allowed herself to feel since the morning of the 6th of April, when her uncle had shaken her hand. She felt the beginning of something that was hers. 23 stakes had not taken. Mabel Doolin came up with a second bundle on the 10th day, the bundle humming faintly in the steady wind like a row of fiddle strings. And Hetty pulled the failed stakes one by one and replaced them, pressing the new wood deep into the wet soil, where the old wood had failed, tamping each one with her boot heel. By the 1st of June, the first green buds appeared. They appeared along the stakes that had been farthest down the downhill lip of the swale, where the soil was wettest, and they appeared as small pale points pushing up through the gray bark, no bigger than pinheads. By the 15th of June, the buds had become leaves small and narrow, and trembling in the constant wind. And by the end of July, the stakes were not stakes anymore. They were willow shoots, each one between 4 and 6 feet tall, flexible and green, with root systems that had spread 18 inches in every direction beneath the soil, gripping the wet earth like the fingers of a great green hand. And the wind behind them was different. It was not still. The wind moved through the willow shoots and around them and over them, and the willow shoots bent with it, bowed with it, gave way to it, the way a flag gives way. And on the downhill side of the crescent, where Hetty had built her small fire pit and laid her bedroll, the wind had become a breeze, a slow rustling movement of air that came through the leaves with a sound she would later learn was the sound she would fall asleep to for the next 28 years of her life. It was the sound of the ridge breathing. She slept beside the swale on the 28th of July. She woke just past midnight. She did not know at first what had woken her. The wind had picked up, but the wind picking up was not unusual. Then she saw the flash, a long white sheet of lightning that flickered behind the eastern ridges and lit the inside of the clouds. From within, the way a lamp behind a curtain shows the shape of the curtain. There was no thunder yet. The storm was perhaps 8 miles east. She sat up and pulled the wool coat around her shoulders and watched the flashes. Mabel Doolin was down in the hollow that night. Mabel Doolin's husband had taken sick 3 days before with a bad cold, and Mabel was sitting up with him in their cabin. And she could not see the ridge from her window, and she could not see the lightning that was now moving in a slow, steady arc up the valley from the east. And she could not have come up the ridge that night, even if she had wanted to. The bad cold was nothing serious. The husband would recover within the week. But Mabel Doolin was a woman who, having lost one person to neglect of attention, did not neglect attention when it was needed elsewhere, and she was not on the ridge that night. Hetty was alone. The storm reached the ridge at perhaps 1 in the morning. The wind shifted suddenly, swinging hard out of the south, and the rain came not in drops, but in a single sweeping wall of water that moved up the slope from the hollow and broke over the ridgetop in a noise like a freight train. The lightning was no longer behind the eastern ridges. The lightning was overhead. It cracked open the sky in long, jagged white veins, and the thunder came on the heels of each crack so close together that the air shook continuously. And Hetty crouched in the lee of the largest stump with her arms over her head. It was the last standing oak on the ridge that took the strike. It was the largest of the dead stumps, the one she had been sleeping behind for 3.5 months, the one whose root system still reached 15 feet in every direction beneath the soil. The lightning came down through the wet air and found the highest point on the ridge and entered the dead oak through the splintered top and went through it lengthwise and exited through the roots and out into the ground, and the stump split down the middle with a sound like a rifle shot. and the heartwood of the stump, which had been rotting for 12 years and was dry as paper in its core, caught fire. It caught fire from inside. Hetty did not see the flame at first because the flame was inside the stump. She saw smoke. White smoke pouring out of the split top of the stump in a column that the wind immediately bent and pulled to the northeast. And then she saw the orange glow inside the split. And then she saw the first flame come up out of the heart of the dead oak and find the wind. The wind was out of the south. The willows were to the northwest. The fire, finding the wind, leaned northwest. It leaned toward the willows. Hetty ran. She ran to the cooking pot at her fire pit and grabbed it and ran to the swale and dropped to her knees and filled the pot with wet mud and water from the bottom of the trench. And she ran back to the burning stump and threw the wet mud into the fire and into the flames coming up out of the split. The mud hissed. It hissed and steamed and bought her perhaps 30 seconds. She ran back to the swale and filled the pot again. She did this for the next 6 hours. She did not stop. The fire inside the stump had become a chimney of flame, and the wind had become a steady 20 miles an hour out of the south. And the embers from the burning stump began to lift on the wind and fly northwest in a long arc toward the willows. Each ember was the size of a thumbnail. Each ember was hot enough to start a grass fire in the dry summer grass that grew between the stump and the swale, and the grass between the stump and the swale was perhaps 80 feet wide, and the grass was tender. She ran with the pot. She ran with her wool coat soaked in swale water, dragging it across the grass to smother the small fires the embers started. She ran with her bare hands when the pot was being filled, beating out the small flames with her palms, burning the skin off her palms in patches the size of coins. She ran back to the swale and filled the pot, and ran back to the stump and threw the water, and ran back to the grass and beat out the fires, and ran back to the swale and ran back to the stump, and ran back to the grass. 6 hours. The thunder moved off east at perhaps 3 in the morning. The rain slowed at perhaps 4. By 5, the storm was a flickering pale glow behind the western ridges, and the rain had stopped entirely, and the wind had eased back to perhaps 10 miles an hour, and the fire inside the stump had burned through the last of the dry heartwood, and was now subsiding into a deep red bed of coals that no longer threw embers because there was no more fuel. Hetty was on her knees in the grass, between the stump and the swale. She was covered in mud and soot. Her wool coat was torn in 3 places. Her palms were burned in 6 places and bleeding in 4. Her face was black with smoke and streaked with the pale tracks where sweat had cut through. She could not stand up. She had nothing left to stand up with. She crawled to the line of willows. She crawled the 80 feet from the stump to the western end of the crescent, and she crawled along the line, counting in her head as she went, looking at each stake she had planted. Each shoot she had watched bud and leaf in the past 6 weeks. The first 20 stakes at the western end were unburned. The next 40 were unburned. She kept crawling. She kept counting. 23 of the willows in the middle of the crescent were charred. They had taken the embers. The dry summer leaves had caught and burned, and the green wood beneath had blackened, and the small root crowns at the base had been scorched, and these 23 were dead. They would not come back. She knew this without having to think about it. But the other 317 were alive. 317 out of 340. She lay down on her side in the wet grass at the western end of the crescent, and she watched the eastern sky begin to lighten over the ridge, and she did not cry because crying still was not what was needed. But she lay there, and she felt the slow, steady stirring of something in her chest that was very close to laughter and very close to grief, and very far from anything she had felt in the 4 years since her mother died. Mabel Doolin came up the ridge at 9 in the morning. She had heard the thunder in the night. She had heard the strike. She had stepped outside her cabin at 3 in the morning when the rain stopped. And she had looked up at the ridge, and she had seen the small orange glow of the fire inside the stump still burning. And she had known. She had not been able to climb in the dark in the rain. She had waited for first light, and she had come up as soon as it was safe. She came up the slope. She walked through the wreckage. She walked past the burned stumps still smoking. She walked past the patches of scorched grass. She walked along the line of willows, counting the dead ones, counting the live ones. She came to the western end. She found Hetty lying on her side in the wet grass covered in soot and mud, her hands wrapped in strips of the torn wool coat, her face streaked black and white. She knelt down beside her. She did not speak for a long time. She looked at the line of 317 living willows curving across the northwest face of the ridge. She looked at Hetty's burned hands. She looked at the smoking stump where the lightning had come down. She looked at the broad mound of mud and ash that Hetty had piled around the base of the stump in the night to keep the flame from spreading along the surface roots. She put one hand on Hetty's shoulder. She did not say anything. She did not need to say anything. She nodded once, a slow, deliberate movement of the head that was not an embrace and not a benediction, but was something more durable than either. And Hetty understood, lying in the wet grass, with this iron-haired woman's hand on her shoulder, that what had passed between them in that nod was the thing that Mabel Doolin had been unable to give for 15 years, and had now given anyway on terms that neither of them would ever speak of again. She closed her eyes. She slept on the grass for 4 hours. When she woke, Mabel Doolin had built a small fire away from the willows, and there was bread and cold water and a clean cloth for Hetty's hands. The summer wore on. The willows that had survived the fire grew faster, as if the loss of the dead 23 had given them more room to spread. By the middle of August, they were 8 feet tall, dense with narrow green leaves that trembled and rippled in the wind, like a sheet of green water held up on its edge. The wind that came over the northwest face of the ridge passed through the willows, now slowed by the leaves and the branches and the soft swaying of the upper shoots. And where Hetty had set her small fire pit and her bedroll, the wind was a breeze. She began to think about a real shelter. She did not think about sod. She thought about stone. She had begun to gather creek stones in the second week of August, hauling them up from Sandy Creek in the canvas sack she had carried her belongings in on the morning of the 6th of April. She could carry perhaps 20 pounds at a time. She made 40 trips a day. She did this for 12 days. And at the end of the 12 days, she had a pile of flat creek stones, smooth on their faces and squared at their edges, perhaps 4 feet high and 10 feet across, sitting on the lee side of the swale where she had decided to build. She did not know how to lay stone. She knew how to dig and how to plant and how to cut sod, but she had never built a stone wall in her life. And she sat one evening looking at her pile of creek stones and trying to figure out how a person made the stones stay in a wall without falling down. And she did not have an answer. That was the afternoon her uncle came up the ridge. She heard him before she saw him. She heard the heavy step of a man climbing the steep eastern trail, the same trail she had climbed on the afternoon of the 6th of April, with her canvas sack on her shoulder. She heard him pause near the top to catch his breath. She heard him say something under his breath she could not make out. Perhaps a curse at the wind, perhaps just a sigh. And then she heard his boots come up over the rim, and she turned, and Garrett Vance was standing at the edge of her swale, looking at 317 willow trees and a pile of creek stones, and a girl who was no longer the girl he had shaken hands with 4 months and 10 days earlier. He had not aged. He had become smaller. He stood at the edge of the swale with his hat in his hands, and he looked at the willows for a long time without speaking. And Hetty watched him look, and she understood several things at once. She understood that he had come up the ridge because he had heard. She understood that the story being told in Grayson was no longer the story of the orphan girl planting dead sticks. The story being told in Grayson was the story of the orphan girl whose dead sticks had become a green wall on the cursed acre. She understood that Garrett Vance was not a stupid man. He could count. He could see that 317 willow trees on the northwest face of the ridge were worth something. He could see that a girl who had survived 4 months on the cursed acre was no longer a girl who could be shaken hands with and dismissed. He could see that an arrangement had ended and that another arrangement might begin. He cleared his throat. He said, "Hetty." She did not say anything. He said, "You done well up here. Better than I would have credited. I want you to know. I took notice." She did not say anything. He turned his hat over in his hands. He looked at the willows. He looked at the pile of stones. He looked at her. He said, "I've been thinking on it, Hetty, about the 4 years you was with us. The food and the roof and all. I've been figuring up what it cost me to keep you fed you and the work you did set against it. I've been doing the arithmetic." She waited. He said, "I figure you owe me about $200. The wind moved through the willows behind her. Hetty heard it move. She heard the long, slow, rustling sound that she had come to know better than any other sound in her life. The sound of the ridge breathing the sound of 317 living trees standing between her body and the wind that had killed 2 families before her. She looked at her uncle. She looked at the man who had set her belongings on the road at 5 in the morning on her 17th birthday and shaken her hand and called it a finished business. She looked at the man who had circled her birthday on a kitchen calendar 4 years before it came. She looked at the man who had counted down to her ejection from his house with the patience of a man counting down to a harvest, and who was now standing at the edge of the harvest he had thrown away and asking to be paid for what he had thrown. She did not raise her voice. She did not stand up. She was sitting on a stump with the paring knife across her knees. The same paring knife she had carried up this ridge in a canvas sack on the morning he had handed her. Her own life. And she looked at him across the 8 feet of dirt and ash and willow root that separated them. And she spoke quietly the way Mabel Doolin had spoken to her on the morning of the 2nd of May. She said, "Uncle Garrett." He waited. She said, "You shook my hand to end it. That handshake ended every claim you had on me and on everything I have done since. You do not get to come back now and try to take what I have made." He opened his mouth. She said, "I am not finished." He closed his mouth. She said, "I owe you nothing. You owe me nothing." The handshake closed the account. "If you bring a suit against me in the courthouse in Grayson, I will appear, and I will bring my books, and I will count for the judge every hour of work I did in your fields for 4 years, and we will see whether the food and the roof outweigh the labor, or the labor outweighs the food. I do not think it will go the way you imagine." She paused. She said, "Go down the ridge, Uncle Garrett. Do not come up again." Garrett Vance stood there in the wind for a long moment with his hat in his hands. He looked at her. He looked at the willows. He looked once at the pile of creek stones, and then he put his hat back on his head, and he turned and he walked down the eastern trail, and he did not look back. Hetty watched him go. She watched until he was a small, dark figure in the hollow. And then she watched until he was gone. And then she sat for a long time with the paring knife across her knees, and her hands flat on the stump, and her face turned into the wind that came soft through the willows. She thought he was finished. She was wrong. She did not learn she was wrong for another 2 weeks. And by the time she did, Eli Doolin had come up the ridge with a hammer and a chisel and a level. And Hetty had begun to learn what stone could be made to do. He came up on the morning of the 15th of August. He was Mabel Doolin's husband, a man of perhaps 55, with the broad, heavy shoulders of a man who had spent his life lifting weight, and the careful, slow hands of a man who knew where to set things down. He did not speak when he came up over the rim of the ridge. He stood at the edge of the swale and looked at the willows for perhaps 15 minutes without saying anything. And then he walked over to the pile of creek stones, and he picked one up and he turned it in his hands, and he set it down. He picked up another. He set it down. He picked up a third. He set it down. Then he looked at Hetty. He said, "These are good stones." She said, "I do not know how to lay them." He nodded. He took off his coat. He picked up 2 of the largest stones and set them on the ground in front of him, in the place where Hetty had cleared a flat patch for the foundation. He set them side by side. He looked at where they touched. He took the smaller stone away. He picked up a different smaller stone and set it against the larger one. He looked again. He took it away. He picked up a third smaller stone, and this one he kept, and he set it firmly against the larger stone so that the 2 faces met along almost their entire length. He looked at Hetty. He said, "Find the face. Set it to its neighbor." She watched him for the rest of that day. She watched him the next day. She watched him for 3 days, and on the 4th day she picked up a stone, and she turned it in her hands, and she set it against a neighbor. And Eli Doolin looked at it and nodded once and didn't have to take it away. And she understood that she had begun to learn how to read what the creek had already shaped. The walls went up in courses of stone, perhaps 4 inches high, laid without mortar. Each stone fitted to the stones beside it, and beneath it the way a hand fits into another hand. 18 inches thick, 5 feet tall when complete. A single chimney at the north end drawing straight up through a flue Eli built from flat slate he had carried up from the creek in his own canvas sack. A roof of cedar poles he cut from the slope below the ridge and lashed down to iron pins he drove into the top course of the stone walls. He did not take payment. When Hetty tried, he looked at her once and said, Mabel would not allow it. The house was finished on the 3rd of October. She slept inside it the first night with the door closed and the chimney drawing and a small fire burning in the hearth. And the wind moved through the willows on the northwest face of the ridge and arrived at the stone walls as a breeze. And she lay on her bedroll on the dirt floor of her own house. And for the first time in 28 weeks, she slept the whole night through. The summons came in a brown envelope. It was delivered to the house on the ridge by a county constable named Bart Hollis on the morning of the 11th of November in the year 1893. And the constable was a young man, perhaps 26, who had climbed the eastern trail in a cold drizzle and stood at the door of Hetty's stone house with the envelope in his hand and the expression of a man who would rather have been anywhere else. He said, "Miss Vance." She said, "Yes." He held out the envelope. He said, "Carter County Circuit Court. You are required to appear at 10 in the morning on the 2nd of December in the matter of Vance versus Vance claim for restitution and unpaid maintenance, $200. She took the envelope. She looked at it for a long time. Bart Hollis cleared his throat. He said, "I am sorry, miss. I do not know your uncle except by name, but I have heard the story of this ridge in town, and I will say to you that the courthouse is a fair place, and the judge is a fair man, and you should not be afraid to come." She looked up at him. She said, "I am not afraid." He nodded. He touched the brim of his hat. He turned and went back down the trail. She closed the door. She set the envelope on the small wooden table Eli Doolin had built her 2 weeks earlier from cedar boards, and she stood there in the kitchen of her own house, with the cold drizzle running down the small window. Eli had set into the south wall, and she did not open the envelope for an hour, because she did not need to open it. She knew what was inside it. She had known from the moment her Uncle Garrett had walked back down the Eastern Trail in August that he would not be content to walk, and that she had not seen the end of him. She had been preparing for 3 months. She had kept the books. She had kept them since the morning of her 14th birthday, when her mother had been 3 months in the ground, and her father had been 2 months gone, and her Uncle Garrett had set her to weeding the corn rows in the back 20 acres of his farm. She had begun keeping the books that day, not because she had foreseen this exact morning in November of '93, but because her mother had taught her when she was 9 years old that a woman who does not keep a record of her own labor will find one day that nobody else has kept it either. She kept her books in a small leather-bound ledger that her mother had given her on her 10th birthday, and that she had carried with her in the canvas sack on the morning of the 6th of April. She wrote in it every Sunday evening in the small, careful hand her mother had taught her the work she had done that week. She wrote it in columns: date, task, hours, the going wage in Carter County for a day's labor in the field of any farmer for a girl of her age and ability, which she knew because she had asked the hired man Cyrus Pickens about it once when she was 15, and Cyrus, who had liked her, had told her 40 cents a day for a girl, $6 a month. She had worked by her own count over 4 years, 1,280 days for her Uncle Garrett, most of them 10-hour days, some of them 12, a few of them in the worst of the August harvests, 14 and 15. She had been paid nothing. She did the arithmetic on the morning of the 11th of November at her cedar table by the window. She did it twice. The total of her labor computed at the going wage for a girl of her age and ability in Carter County was $512. She set against it the cost of her keep, which Garrett had estimated at $50 a year, which Hetty did not contest, because $50 a year was probably about right for a girl who had eaten the family table and slept in the room off the kitchen and worn her own dress until it fell apart. $200 for 4 years, $512 of labor, $200 of keep. The balance in her favor was $312. She wrote it out clean on a fresh page in her best hand. She wrote the date columns. She wrote the task columns. She wrote the hours. She wrote the totals. She did it carefully twice until she had it on one large sheet of paper that she could carry into a courthouse and lay down on a table in front of a judge. Then she walked down the ridge in the rain to Mabel Doolin's cabin, and she sat at Mabel's kitchen table while Mabel read the page through twice slowly, with her finger under each line. Mabel looked up at her. She said, 312. Hetty said, yes. What do you mean to do with it? I do not mean to ask for it, Hetty said. I mean to show the judge that the account is not what my uncle says it is. I do not want his money. I only want the suit dismissed. Mabel folded the paper. She handed it back across the table. She said, you will need a witness. You will need a person who knew you in his house and who saw what you did. Hetty said, who? Mabel said, Cyrus Pickens. Cyrus Pickens was the hired man. He was 48 years old in November of 1893. He had worked for Garrett Vance for 11 years. He had taught Hetty how to mend a fence and how to read the sky for rain and how to set a milking stool so the cow did not kick it over. And he had been the only person in her uncle's house besides her mother's memory who had ever spoken to her as if she were a person with a name and not a small piece of useful furniture in a kitchen. He came up the ridge on the morning of the 17th of November. Mabel had sent him a note through the dry goods store. He had read the note. He had walked off the Vance farm at noon the next day without telling Garrett where he was going. And he had walked up the eastern trail to Hetty's stone house in the cold gray light of a November afternoon. And he stood at the door with his hat in his hands, and he said, "Miss Hetty, I heard. I will come to court for you." She let him in. She put a kettle on the fire. He sat at the cedar table, and he looked at her ledger book, and he ran his finger down the columns of work, and he said, "I remember every one of these days." She said, "Will you say so in the courthouse?" He said, "I will." She poured the tea. He drank it. He said, "Miss Hetty, I should have spoke up for you 4 years ago. I did not. I will not make it right now. But I will speak in that courtroom." She said, "Mr. Pickens, the speaking now is the only speaking that matters. The rest is past." He nodded. He put down the cup. He went back down the ridge. The 2nd of December came cold and clear. Hetty walked into the Carter County Courthouse at 9 in the morning wearing the cotton dress she had brought up the ridge in the canvas sack on the 6th of April, and a clean apron Mabel had pressed for her and her hair pulled back in a single braid that fell to the middle of her back. She carried the ledger book in her right hand and the single sheet of arithmetic in her left. She had not slept the night before. The courtroom was on the 2nd floor. It had a high ceiling and tall windows and rows of dark oak benches, polished smooth by 60 years of farmers and merchants and witnesses sitting in them. And the bench at the front was raised 3 steps above the floor. And behind the bench sat Judge Marcus Hawthorne, who had been the circuit judge in Carter County for 18 years, and who had a reputation even among the lawyers for listening longer than he needed to. Garrett Vance was already there. He sat at the plaintiff's table with a lawyer beside him, a heavy-set man from Ashland named Briscoe Tate, who Hetty did not know and who had been hired, she would later learn, for a flat fee of $15 to bring the suit and collect from the proceeds, if any. Garrett did not look at her when she came in. He sat with his hat in his lap and his hands folded on the hat and his eyes on the table in front of him. Hetty sat at the defendant's table alone. She had no lawyer. She had not been able to afford one. She had asked Mabel in late November whether she should go into Grayson and look for one, and Mabel had looked at her across the kitchen table and said, "Hetty, a lawyer will say to a judge what you have already written down. You can say it yourself." She had said it herself. She would say it herself today. Judge Hawthorne came in at 10 minutes past 10. He looked at the courtroom. He looked at Garrett and at Briscoe Tate. He looked at Hetty sitting alone at the defendant's table with her ledger book. He raised one eyebrow. He sat down. He said, "Mr. Tate, proceed." Briscoe Tate proceeded. He stood up and he laid out the case in a way Hetty had to admit was professional. He described the death of Hetty's mother in 1889. He described the disappearance of her father 3 weeks later. He described the generosity of Garrett Vance, the only living adult relative, in taking the orphan girl into his home and raising her for 4 years at no small expense. Food, he said. Clothing. Shelter. The kindness of a Christian household. He named the figure. $200 in maintenance. He claimed the figure had been ungratefully refused by the defendant upon reaching her majority and removing herself from the plaintiff's home without compensation. And he asked the court to compel payment. He sat down. Judge Hawthorne looked at Hetty. He said, "Miss Vance, do you wish to respond?" She stood up. Her hands were not shaking. She had not expected this. She had thought her hands would shake. They did not. She walked around the defendant's table and stood in the small space between the table and the bench, and she held up the ledger book. She said, "Your Honor, I have kept a record." Judge Hawthorne said, "What kind of record, Miss Vance?" She said, "A record of the work I did in my uncle's fields, every day, for 4 years, with the going wage in Carter County for a girl of my age and ability for each of those days. Your Honor, I do not contest that my uncle gave me a roof and a place at his table. I have set the value of that keep at $50 a year, which I believe to be fair, and which gives him $200 over 4 years, the sum he now claims. I do not contest the $200. I have written it into the account." She paused. She said, "But the account does not end at $200. The account also includes my labor. $512 of labor computed at 40 cents a day for 1,280 days of work. I have the days. I have the tasks. I have the hours. The balance of the account is $312 in my favor." The courtroom went very quiet. Judge Hawthorne held out his hand. He said, "May I see the book?" She walked the ledger book to the bench and laid it on the railing in front of him. He picked it up. He opened it. He turned the pages slowly. He read for perhaps 15 minutes with his head bent low and his finger moving down the columns. And the courtroom remained quiet. And Hetty stood at the defendant's table and waited. And Garrett Vance sat at the plaintiff's table with his hands still folded on his hat and his eyes still on the wood in front of him. And Briscoe Tate sat beside Garrett and slowly began to understand that he had taken a case he should not have taken. Judge Hawthorne closed the book. He set it on his bench. He said, "Miss Vance, do you have a witness who can testify to the work recorded in this book?" She said, "I do, Your Honor. Mr. Cyrus Pickens, the hired man on my uncle's farm, who worked alongside me for 4 years." The judge said, "Is Mr. Pickens present?" Cyrus Pickens stood up from the third row of the gallery. He said, "I am, Your Honor." The judge motioned him forward. Cyrus Pickens was sworn. He took the witness chair beside the bench. He answered the questions Hetty put to him in a clear, steady voice. He described the work she had done in the fields. He described the hours. He confirmed the wage. He confirmed that no payment had ever been made to her in coin or in any other form for any of that labor. He spoke for perhaps 20 minutes. Briscoe Tate did not cross-examine him. Briscoe Tate had stopped looking at his client. Judge Hawthorne thanked Cyrus Pickens and excused him. He looked down at the ledger book on his bench. He looked at Garrett Vance. He looked at Hetty. He sat for a long moment with his hands flat on the wood of the bench, and then he picked up his gavel. He said, "Mr. Vance, the court finds that the plaintiff has substantially overstated the account between himself and his niece. The court further finds that, on the evidence presented, the balance of the account runs in the opposite direction. The court does not, however, find that the defendant has counterclaimed for the difference, and so the court will not award damages in her favor. The court will only dismiss the plaintiff's claim with prejudice and assess the costs of this action against the plaintiff." He brought the gavel down. He said, "Costs are $18. Mr. Vance, you may settle them with the clerk before you leave the building." Garrett Vance did not look up. He sat at the plaintiff's table with his hands folded on his hat for perhaps 30 seconds after the gavel had come down. Then he stood up slowly, the way a man stands up when his legs have gone half to sleep. And he walked past Hetty without looking at her, and he walked out of the courtroom. And he walked down the stairs. and he walked into the clerk's office, and he paid the $18 in cash from a small leather pouch he carried inside his coat. He walked out of the courthouse onto Main Street in Grayson. He did not look back at the second-floor window where his niece was standing. She watched him go from that window. She watched him until he was a small figure walking south on the road that ran out of town. She watched him until he passed the last building. She watched him until he was gone. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel pity. She felt the slow, steady thing she had begun to feel on the 9th of May, when the first 23 willow stakes had pulled loose in her hand, and she had replaced them. The thing that was not satisfaction and not victory, but was the thing that was left over after both of those had been used up. She felt the work continuing. She walked back to the ridge. It snowed for the first time that winter on the 18th of December. It snowed lightly, perhaps 3 inches, and the willows along the northwest face of the ridge held the snow on their narrow leaves the way a woman holds salt in a folded apron, gathered and gentle. Hetty walked the length of the crescent in the early morning with her hands in the pockets of her wool coat, and she thought, looking at the small white burdens on each green shoot, that the ridge had become a different place. The next year, she planted a second crescent. She dug the second swale on the southwest face in April, before the ground had fully thawed. 260 stakes cut from the original willows at the end of February when she had pruned them for the first time. She did the digging alone. She did the planting alone. Mabel came up at the end of the work and walked the second swale and nodded and went back down. The willows were no longer the work of 2 women. They were the work of one. By the autumn of 1895, Hetty had planted a third crescent on the northeast face of the ridge and the center of the ridge where her stone house sat. Between the curving green walls of the willow trees was calmer than the bottom of any hollow in Carter County. The wind that had killed 2 families in 20 years had been broken into a network of slow, soft currents by the layered crescents of willow. And the wind that arrived at the stone walls of her house was the kind of wind a person could fall asleep listening to. She began to sell stakes. She sold them for 2 cents each in bundles of 50 to the farmers in the hollows along Sandy Creek and Plum Branch and Grayson Run. She delivered them in the canvas sack she had carried her life in on the morning of the 6th of April. She walked the back ridges, the same ridges she had once walked carrying water to her uncle's fields. The farmers paid her in coin. By the spring of 1896, she was earning between $3 and $5 a month in stake sales alone, which was more than Cyrus Pickens had ever earned in a month as her uncle's hired man. She thought about that once in March of 1896. She thought about it for a moment, and then she did not think about it again because Mabel had said to her once that the satisfaction of earning your own money is dulled when you measure it against the man who threw you out. And Mabel was right. She did not measure it against him. She measured it against the work. The blizzard came in February of 1899. It came on the night of the 3rd, and it was the worst storm Carter County had seen in 30 years. It dropped 14 inches of snow in 8 hours with winds out of the north at gusts of 40 miles an hour, and the temperature fell to 8 degrees below zero. The willows on the ridge bent down under the weight of the snow until their upper shoots touched the ground, and the ridge behind its 3 crescents of bent willow became a still pocket of cold air in which a person could move and breathe and see. The hollows were not still. The hollows were choked with drifting snow that came in over the rims and piled against the cabins and buried the fence lines in the gardens and the lower branches of the trees. The roads were impassable by sundown of the 3rd. By midnight, the entire bottom of the Plum Branch Hollow was under 6 feet of drift, and the cabin of Wendell Crandall, the oldest sheep farmer in that hollow, was no longer visible from any direction. Wendell Crandall was 70 years old. He had gone out at 5 in the afternoon before the storm broke to bring his small flock of 20 Cheviot ewes in from the south pasture. He had not made it back. He had reached the pasture. He had gathered the sheep. He had started the long walk back along the creek bottom, and the storm had come down on him in the open between the pasture and the cabin. And he had become disoriented in the white, blowing dark, and he had taken shelter in a small thicket of laurel at the bend in the creek, where the bank rose into a low overhang. His wife, Mercy Crandall, walked through the storm at midnight to Mabel Doolin's cabin. She walked because she had no choice. The Crandalls had no children at home. Their nearest neighbor besides Mabel was a half-mile further down the hollow, and the road in that direction was already drifted shut. Mercy was 68 years old, and she walked the quarter-mile to Mabel's door in snow that came up to her hips in places. And she pounded on the door, and Mabel opened it, and Mercy fell forward into the front room and said, "Wendell." Mabel said, "Where?" Mercy said, "South pasture, trying to bring in the sheep. 3 hours overdue." Mabel looked out at the night. She looked at the snow coming sideways in the lamplight. She said, "I cannot go. I am too heavy in this snow. I will founder." She paused. She said, "I will send for Hetty." She wrote a note. She gave it to Mercy. She said, "Go back to your cabin and stay warm. I will get word up the ridge." She did not send Mercy. Mercy could not walk back up to the ridge in this snow. Mabel sent her oldest grandson Tobias, a boy of 15, who lived with her since her son's death the year before. Tobias took the note and a lantern and the heavy oak walking stick his grandfather Eli had used, and he climbed the eastern trail of the ridge in the dark and the snow at 12:30 in the morning. And he banged on the door of Hetty's stone house at 1:15. Hetty opened the door. She read the note. She put on her wool coat and her boots and the leather mittens Mabel had made for her 3 Christmases ago, and she took down from a peg by the door the long ash walking stick she had cut from a sapling on the south slope 2 summers earlier and shaped for her own height. And she said to Tobias, "Go down to your grandmother's cabin. Stay there. Do not try to come up again tonight." Tobias said, "Miss Hetty, I should come with you." She said, "You are 15 years old, Tobias. Your grandmother will need you alive in the morning. Go down." He went down. She walked off the ridge to the south. She walked along the swale of the 3rd crescent where the willows had broken the wind on the south slope. And she stayed inside the band of calm air the willows had made all the way down to where the 3rd crescent ended, at the western shoulder of the ridge. Then she stepped out of the calm and into the storm, and the wind hit her like a hand against her left side, and she leaned into it, and she began to walk south through the Plum Branch Hollow toward the Crandall pasture. She had 2 miles to go. She was 23 years old. She had spent 6 years on the ridge, 6 years of walking that ridge in every kind of weather, 6 years of learning to read what the wind was doing by the way it pulled at her coat and the way it pushed at her boots and the way it sounded in the bare branches of the dead trees in winter. She knew the wind. She had been studying the wind since she was 17 years old. She knew what the wind did in a north-driven storm in this particular hollow, because she had walked this particular hollow at every season, in every weather for 6 years. She knew that the north wind in a blizzard piled drift on the south side of any obstacle and left bare ground on the north side, and that a person walking in a blizzard could find their way by feeling for the bare ground. She knew that the laurel thickets along the bends of Plum Branch were the only shelter in the hollow that didn't get buried. She knew where the laurel thickets were. She walked. She found Wendell Crandall at 3 in the morning. He was in the laurel thicket at the 3rd bend of the creek, the one where the bank rose into the overhang. He was sitting with his back to the bank. He was wrapped in his coat. He was conscious. He was very cold. 3 of his sheep were lying around him, pressed close to his body, and the other 17 were huddled deeper in the thicket against the bank. He looked up at her when she came into the thicket with her lantern. He said, "Hetty." She said, "Mr. Crandall." He said, "I knew the laurel would hold." She said, "Yes, sir, I knew you would know." She built a small fire of the dry laurel sticks she had gathered as she came in. She warmed his hands inside her own coat. She fed him bread she had wrapped against her body inside her dress to keep it from freezing. She kept him talking. She waited for the storm. The storm broke at 6 in the morning. The wind dropped from 40 to 10. The snow stopped. The sky began to gray in the east. Hetty helped Wendell Crandall to his feet, and she walked him out of the laurel thicket, and the sheep followed in a line behind him, the way sheep will follow the man who has fed them, through a hard night. And they came up the hollow together at first light, and Mercy Crandall saw them from her window at 6:45, and ran out of her cabin in her bare feet through the snow, and embraced her husband in the road in front of her own door. Hetty did not stay. She turned and walked back along the same path she had come 2 miles back through the hollow, up the ridge into the calm band of her willows. She got to her stone house at 8 in the morning. She built up the fire. She sat in the chair Eli had built her by the hearth, and she fell asleep sitting upright with her wool coat still on and her boots still on, and she did not wake up until late in the afternoon. The story spread that day. It spread the way stories spread in a county where every cabin had been snowbound for 36 hours, and every man and woman was looking for something to talk about over the rim of the wood stove. The Vance girl, they said. The orphan from the cursed acre. The one who planted the willow trees. She walked off her ridge in the worst of it and went 2 miles through hip-deep snow in a 40-mile wind in the middle of the night. Because she knew the hollow and she knew the wind and she knew where Wendell Crandall would have gone, and she brought him home alive with all 20 of his sheep. The story did not stop in Carter County. It reached Ashland by April. It reached Lexington by June. There was an item in the Lexington paper that summer. 2 short paragraphs that referred to her as Miss Henrietta Vance of Carter County, Kentucky, a woman of independent means and unusual character, whose willow plantings on the bald ridge above Grayson had become an object of study among agricultural men in the region. She was 23 years old. She did not read the Lexington paper. She heard about the article in October when Bart Hollis, the same young constable who had brought her the summons 6 years before, climbed the Eastern Trail one afternoon with a folded copy in his coat pocket and read it to her at her cedar table. She listened. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Bart." He said, "Yes, Miss Hetty." She said, "I prefer Hetty. I have always preferred Hetty." He said, "Yes, Miss Hetty." He folded the paper. He put it back in his coat pocket. He drank the rest of his tea. He went back down the ridge. Garrett Vance came back to the ridge in the spring of 1900. He came in April in a steady, warm rain. He climbed the Eastern Trail slowly, the way an old man climbs a steep trail, although he was only 53, and Hetty watched him come from her window. She watched him stop twice on the slope to catch his breath. She watched him come up over the rim of the ridge, his hat in his hand, his face turned down toward his own boots, and she came out of the house and stood beside the swale of the first crescent and waited for him to reach her. He stopped 6 feet from her. He did not look up. He said, "Hetty." She said, "Uncle Garrett." He said, "I have come to buy willow stakes." She waited. He said, "The wind has been bad on my back fields these 3 years. I have lost the top 6 inches of soil on the upper terraces. The corn this past summer was knee-high in August. I cannot make the land hold what it has, and what it has is going. I have asked the men at the county agent's office, and the men at the county agent's office have told me to come and see you." She said, "How many steaks?" He said, 500. She said, $10. He looked up. He looked at her for the first time. His eyes were the same gray-blue they had been 7 years before, on the porch of his farmhouse, but the rest of his face had aged 20 years in the 7 that had passed. The skin under his jaw had gone slack. His mouth had thinned. He looked at her and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. He said, $10 is a fair price. She said, "It is the price." He took $10 out of the leather pouch inside his coat. He counted it out in coin onto the flat top of a stump that Eli Doolin had cut down 2 years earlier, when he widened the path to the front door. He set the coin in a neat stack. He stepped back. She did not pick up the coin. She walked to the storage shed Eli had built her behind the house, and she counted out 500 willow stakes, each one cut from her own willows in February, each one the thickness of a thumb and 3 feet long, each one with a slant cut at the bottom. She bundled them in tens with strips of bark. She carried them out to the path and stacked them beside the coin. She said, "Plant them in a swale 18 inches deep, 2 feet wide on the contour. Set the stakes 12 inches apart on the downhill lip. Push them 18 inches into the ground. Tamp with your boot. Water them once the first week if there is no rain. After that, they will take the water from the swale." He nodded. She said, "I am not giving them to you, Uncle Garrett. I am selling them." He said, "I understand." She said, "There is a difference." He said, "I understand the difference." He picked up the first bundle of 50 stakes. He carried them down the trail to where his wagon was tied at the foot of the ridge. He came back up. He carried the second bundle down. He went up and down the trail 10 times, carrying 50 stakes at a time. And Hetty stood by the stump and watched him work without offering to help. He was 61 minutes carrying the stakes down the ridge. When the last bundle was down, he came back up to the stump where the $10 still sat in its neat stack. He looked at her. He said, "Hetty." She did not say anything. He said, "I was wrong on the morning of the 6th of April. I was wrong on the day I came up here in August. I was wrong on the 2nd of December in the courthouse. I have been wrong a long time." She did not say anything. He said, "I do not ask you to forgive it. I only say it because it is true." He picked up his hat. He walked back down the trail. She did not see him again. He planted the willow stakes along 3 of his back fields. They rooted. They grew. The wind was broken on his upper terraces by the end of the following summer, and the topsoil began slowly to come back. He lived another 9 years on his farm. He died in 1909 of a heart that gave out in his sleep. Hetty did not go to the funeral. Mabel did. Mabel came back up the ridge that evening and sat at Hetty's cedar table and drank tea, and did not speak of it, and Hetty did not ask. And neither of them ever mentioned the funeral again. Mabel Doolin died in October of 1902. She was 60 years old. She had been ill for 2 months, with a slow wasting that the doctor could not name. And she died in her own bed, in her own cabin. In the hollow she had lived in since she was 19, and the funeral was on a Tuesday afternoon at the small Methodist church at the head of Sandy Creek. And the church was full, and Hetty sat in the front row beside Eli Doolin and did not speak. She spoke at the grave. The minister said his words. The men of the family threw the first earth. Then the minister turned to Hetty because he had been told by Eli that Hetty would want to speak. And Hetty stepped forward to the edge of the open ground, and she stood there in the cold October wind in her wool coat. and she looked down at the box that held the woman who had walked up her ridge 9 years earlier with a spade and a canvas bag. She said, "She told me I could not build on the ridge. She said I could only grow on it." She was right about both. She did not say anything else. She stepped back. Eli Doolin gave her the trowel that evening. It was the stone-laying trowel he had used to build her chimney in October of 1893. The small, flat-bladed tool with a worn oak handle, and he handed it to her in the front room of his cabin after the supper. Mabel's sisters had prepared, and he said, "The stone is done. The trees are still doing the work." She took the trowel. She said, "Mr. Doolin." He said, "Eli." She said, "Eli, thank you." He nodded. He looked away. She walked back up the ridge that night with the trowel in her coat pocket. The years passed. She planted a 4th crescent in 1904 and a 5th in 1907. And by 1910, the network of living willow on the ridge and along the slopes below it had become a feature visible from 3 miles away in every direction. A dark green crown on what had once been a bald white scar. She continued to sell stakes. She pruned the willows twice a year. The prunings became new stakes, and the new stakes became new windbreaks on other farms. And the cycle that Mabel Doolin had brought up the ridge in 3 bundles of 20 on the 10th of May in 1893 continued to turn. The bald ridge had been a place without a name in 1893. It got its name slowly. People in Grayson began calling it Vance's Ridge in the autumn of 1898. After the article in the Lexington paper, the name spread the way the willows spread hollow by hollow, until by 1910, the new county map drawn up by the Carter County Surveyor's Office carried the words Vance's Ridge, printed in small, careful letters across the long, bald spine that had once been only an unmarked line. By 1921, Hetty was 45 years old. The ridge had been her home for 28 years. She had not married. She had not borne children. She had lived alone in the stone house Eli Doolin had built in the calm pocket between the willow crescents, and she had risen at dawn and worked the willows and walked the ridge and sold the stakes and read the books Mabel had left her in the small leather chest at the foot of her bed. And she had grown into the kind of woman that, in the small hill towns of eastern Kentucky, people knew about without ever meeting. A reporter came up the ridge in the spring of that year. He was a young man from a paper in Cincinnati. He had come down on the train to Ashland and ridden a hired horse from Ashland to Grayson and walked the last 3 miles up the eastern trail. He sat at her cedar table and drank her tea, and he asked her questions, and she answered them in the quiet voice she had used at Mabel Doolin's grave. And at the end of the interview, he asked her one last question. He said, "Miss Vance, if you could go back to the morning of the 6th of April in 1893, what would you tell yourself?" She looked at him for a long moment. She looked past him out the small south window Eli had set into the stone wall, at the long green wall of the first crescent of willow trees that ran across the northwest face of the ridge. The trees that had grown from 340 stakes Mabel Doolin had cut from her own grandmother's grove and carried up the ridge in 3 trips on the 10th of May 28 years before. She said, I would not tell her anything. He waited. She said, she knew enough. The wind moved through the willows behind the house, the same long, slow, rustling sound the ridge had been making for 28 years. The sound Hetty Vance had fallen asleep to every night since the 3rd of October in 1893. And the reporter wrote her words down in his small notebook. And he closed the notebook and he thanked her. And he walked back down the trail to Grayson in the soft April light. The cycle that Mabel Doolin had begun with 340 stakes, pushed into a wet trench on a windy morning in May, never stopped turning. It would not stop turning long after the reporter had filed his story. and gone home to Cincinnati long after the willows of the first crescent had grown to 30 feet long, after Hetty Vance herself had become only a name on the county map, and a story told beside the wood stoves of the hollows below. A woman had walked up a ridge with a spade. A girl had not gone back down it. And the wind that had killed 2 families on the cursed acre, and broken 3 sod shelters, and lit a stump with lightning in the summer of '93. The wind moved now in a long, slow circle around Vance's ridge, finding no purchase, finding no opening, finding only the patient, yielding green walls of the willows that had been planted there by a girl who had understood at last that the answer to a hard wind was not a stronger wall. The answer was a thing that could bend. The answer was a thing that was alive.